There are times in life when the stillness is so overwhelming that it seems like the surrounding air is being swallowed by an abyss. That day, the house exuded an overwhelming sense of calm, as if it were embracing me with its breath. It had been weeks or months since Julian had departed for his most recent work trip. I had become so used to his absence that his presence had almost become a memory, a ghost that lurked in the walls but never spoke. I didn't usually complain. I believed that by 34 I had learned to value my alone time. My days would be occupied with routines and tasks. There are only so many times you can rearrange furniture or wash dishes that are already clean, yet loneliness is sneaking into quiet places. I would do everything to keep my thoughts from going too far. Brace had moved in only a month prior to it catching up with you. 20-year-old Julian's kid was tall, self-assured in that carefree manner that young men have, and too silent. We hardly ever talked past courteous greetings. This morning had gone by like any other, so I made coffee, looked through my phone, and looked at the clock. He spent most of his time in his room or outside working on that beat-up car in the driveway, but occasionally I could still smell his cologne lingering in the hallway. It smelled like cedar and something darker that I couldn't quite place. It's nearly noon, and the hours ahead seem endless. In the sweltering summer heat that soaked through the windows and caused everything to adhere to your skin, the notion of taking a cool shower seemed like the most alluring thing I had thought of all day. The mirror caught me, and I saw the lady gazing back at me as I walked up the stairs and into the master bathroom, letting my robe fall off my shoulders before throwing it onto the stool near the vanity. I think there was still beauty in my reflection. Soft curves, smooth skin with a golden sheen under the bathroom lights, but my eyes seemed distant, hollowed out by time and neglect. I turned towards the sink to adjust the faucet, allowing the cold water to run for a moment before the clear stream rushed out. I stared at my reflection for longer than I should have, as if I were looking for something I had lost. Leaning down, I cupped the water in my palms and splashed it naked on my face to dispel the heat. It felt pleasant and energizing even at that moment. Maybe I leaned on it at the wrong angle or turned the faucet too sharply, but I don't know how, but my arm slipped, and my hand got caught between the sink and the cold metal fixture. It twisted just enough to send a dull ache up my shoulder. Damn it, I muttered under my breath as I tried to free it. The more I fought, the more my flesh ached. Painfully pushed against the chilly ceramic, I turned once again, terror prickling. My other hand sought for the fixture and gave it a strong tug, but it remained in place. The sound of the water still running in the basin was the only sound filling the room as I froze, breathing deeply. I was in my own bathroom, fully naked, and it was a comical predicament. The thought of Xavier phoning him had my neck heat up for reasons unrelated to the summertime. I was slapped by the ridiculousness of it all. Here I was, stranded and completely exposed, and I hardly talked to the young man who was the only one who could assist me. But what other option did I have? I couldn't stay here forever. My voice sounded a little softer than I had intended, and I cleared my throat before trying louder this time. It took me a few seconds to hear Xavier's footsteps, which were faint at first but got louder with each step, making my pulse pound harder and my breathing shallow. The bathroom door rattled as his confused voice called out, "Cassandra." "Everything is okay." It was a locked door. I'm grateful for that tiny act of kindness. My voice trembled as I said, "I need your help." A moment occurred. Beyond the door, I could hear the hesitancy in his breathing. Well, what took place? I swallowed forcefully. Every syllable feels like glass against my throat. I can't get my arm out of the sink, can I? I am unable to remove the uncertainty that is trapped in his voice alone. Made me even more embarrassed. "Do you mean stuck?" Despite my desire to simply disappear, I uttered the words I had been dreading. Please, just come in." As if the house itself were holding its breath, the door creaked slowly open as the latch clicked. Then Xavier took over. His gaze rested on my arm, which was jammed uncomfortably in the sink, and then moved lower, lingering in spots that made my skin tingle. For a brief moment, time seemed to slow. He turned away fast, his jaw clenching as I saw his expression change from bewilderment to something I couldn't identify. His cheeks flushed scarlet. My heart thumped so loudly I worried if he could hear it. I felt more vulnerable than ever before, not just physically. Avoid just standing there. I spoke more sharply than I meant to, he remarked hastily. He spoke in a hoarse voice as he got closer, and I tried to concentrate on the sound of the water, rather than the way he was standing so close that I could feel the heat radiating off him. His hands moved to the faucet, carefully tugging, and I could see the veins in his forearms and how his knuckles turned white with effort. "Hold still," he said, his tone quieter now, and I nodded while swallowing hard. His shoulder touched mine as he corrected his grip, giving me an unanticipated chill. I should have avoided staring at the side of his face, where his pointed jaw was clamped in profile while he concentrated on releasing me. His lips parted as the light flickered across his features, but I shouldn't have seen. Xavier said as he focused a little, "I almost got it." He looked at me, our eyes locked for a single heartbeat, and the air between us thickened. I ripped my eyes away, my chest rising and falling too quickly, and my arm throbbing from being stuck. But that wasn't the only pain I knew I had. My mind was a jumble, a tangled knot of shame, embarrassment, and something darker, something I wasn't ready to name at last. With a sharp tug, my arm slipped free, and the sudden release sent me stumbling a little. Xavier instinctively reached out. His hand gripped my waist to steady me, and for a moment neither of us moved, the sink dripping onto the tile, but all I could hear was the sound of our breathing. My skin burned where his hand held me, his eyes locked onto mine, and I felt Paul Rice be the first to step back, releasing me as if I'd scalded. "You're okay now," he said, his voice rough. "Indeed," I said, panting. He nodded, caressing my released wrist, even though my chest still hurt. When the door clicked shut behind him, I sank to the side of the tub, avoiding his eyes as he turned to go, stopping only to mutter, "You should definitely turn off the water." My arm was free, but I didn't feel at all relieved. My legs were shaking. I couldn't stop. Reliving the moment, his hands on me, the look in his eyes. It shouldn't have happened, none of it. But as I sat there in the bathroom silence, I realized that something had changed between us. Something I wasn't prepared to face. If I had known what was going to happen, I might have been able to stop it. But life rarely shows such mercy. The hours that followed passed interminably, and the silence in the house weighed heavily on me. It wasn't the pain in my wrist that overwhelmed me, but I couldn't get rid of the little throb where it had been stuck in my arm. I had already played it 100 times. It was the picture of him, Xavier, standing there with his expression caught between bewilderment and something else. His eyes lingered just long enough to make the air between us too heavy to breathe, despite his clear attempt to turn away. The water had become chilly by the time I got up, and I felt the sensation of something curling beneath my skin, and I despised myself for it. The water dripped into the tile like a gentle echo in the empty room as they switched off the faucet. I had left my robe on the stool, and when I pulled it back over my shoulders, the material was scratchy on my skin. Despite being scraped raw, I chose to ignore the woman and stay away from the mirror, who had just been exposed in a number of ways. Instead, my attention was drawn to taking deep, intentional breaths that did little to ease the constriction in my chest. I had to shake it off in order to forget. Whether it was the sensation of something unrateable in his gaze as he turned to go when I opened the bathroom door, or the heat that had drawn in my stomach as Xavier's hand supported me, The corridor seemed darker than usual, as if the shadows had grown deeper without me. The home was silent once more, but not in the way I was accustomed to. I didn't initially hear him as I walked to the bedroom, gripping my robe firmly, my bare feet patting lightly on the hardwood. But this wasn't calm. It was alive, charged with something I couldn't identify. It was only as I turned the corner and almost ran into Xavier that I realized he was there. He froze, as shocked as I was. "I apologize," he mumbled as he took a swift step back, his hand raising as though to cover his eyes. "He didn't recognize you." "No worries." My voice cut off, harsher than I meant to. With my flesh heating beneath the thin layer of cloth, my heart smashed against my ribs. I wanted to vanish into the floor and remove my hair, which must have given me a certain appearance. His robe was tangled and damp, and it slipped just enough to make me feel completely nude. He didn't actually look at me, but I could see the tightness in his jaw. I saw that his shoulders were more rigid than normal, and Xavier cleared his throat. "I wanted to check on you, so I rubbed the back of his neck with one hand. Looked to be in good health before." Even though my voice was shaking, I blurted out, "Maybe I'm fine." I didn't want him to hear how out of breath I sounded and how wobbly I was. It was simply an accident. I felt pain look over my shoulders and nodded politely to me. He looked down for a while, then back up at me and nodded. I had to keep looking, much longer than it actually was. A few seconds seemed to drag on forever. Yet there was nothing obviously wrong with the way he gazed at me. It was cautious. It was careful. Yet there was something unsaid. "Okay," he murmured at last, his voice lower now, and it sent a slow, unwelcome heat crawling up my spine there just beneath the surface. "If you're certain, my name is Xavier." He turned, his footsteps fading down the hall, but he paused, his lips parting as if he wanted to say more. Left me alone once again. I stayed there for a while, still listening to the faint sound of him coming down the stairs. My skin continued to tingle, like if something had been left behind by his presence, and my pulse continued to pound. I spent the next hour acting as though nothing had happened, and I detested how readily my thoughts had deceived me by taking on forms I didn't want to acknowledge. I went through the motions of my daily routine. Folding laundry, wiping down counters that didn't need to be cleaned. Anything to keep my hands occupied and divert my mind from the image of him standing in the doorway staring at me like that. I told myself that it was all in my head, but the lie tasted bitter on my tongue. Eventually, I found myself on the living room couch with a book open in my lap that I couldn't bring myself to read. The pages blurred before my eyes. The words meaningless. My mind kept wandering uninvited and unwanted to the way Xavier had looked at me. It wasn't right, it wasn't normal, but there was no doubting the way my body had responded to the way my skin still felt sensitive, as if I could still feel the ghost of his touch. A faint footstep, barely audible from the doorway. I checked. Xavier was standing there when I looked up, one hand resting on the frame and the other in his pants pocket. He appeared uncertain, almost hesitant, as if he wasn't sure if he should be there. "I thought you might want some tea or something," he continued softly, his voice low and cautious, and I didn't mean to interrupt. After staring at him for too long, I forced a grin. "It sounds good to drink tea." With a nod, Xavier vanished into the kitchen, leaving me to sit there with my pulse pounding for reasons I couldn't reveal. After a few minutes, he came back with 2 cups, and as he offered one to me, I could feel the slight aroma of chamomile. Our fingers barely touched, but I thought it was sharp and electric, so I drew back too soon, almost spilling the tea. I apologized, my cheeks flushed. "Don't worry," he answered quietly. As I sank into the armchair across from me, the silence that followed wasn't particularly uncomfortable, but it felt heavy, as if we were both waiting for something we couldn't name. It was the first time I realized how mature Xavier had become. the strong lines of his jaw, the quiet confidence in his demeanor, and the fact that he wasn't the boy I remembered. That realization sat uncomfortably in my chest, like something fragile on the verge of breaking. I took a sip of the tea, forcing myself to concentrate on its warmth and the way it settled in my stomach, and Xavier didn't directly watch me. I could sense his eyes lingering long enough to cause me to move in my seat, but it wasn't bothersome. "You're different," he whispered abruptly, in a voice so faint I nearly believed I had dreamed it. With his eyes meeting mine since I moved in with you, Xavier paused before saying anything. "Appeared different, as if you're unhappy here." With a sharp gulp, my throat tightened. "What you imply is unclear to me." Something in me cracked when he gave me a gentle, almost understanding gaze, even if he didn't argue. I shifted my attention to the window and gazed at the dim light outside. "I just hope you're okay," Xavier murmured, attempting to ignore the pain in my chest. "It's not my business." I stared at him once more, and for a moment I was unable to breathe. The room seemed smaller in some way, and there was a charge between us that I didn't want to name. I opened my mouth to reply, but nothing came out. Rice stared at me for another second before putting down his empty mug and saying, "Good night, Cassandra," and then he left, leaving me alone in the quiet house once more. But this time, the silence felt different. It was not quiet. It was alive and throbbing with something I couldn't control. And for the first time in a long time, I was scared of where this was headed, because I knew deep down that it had already started and that there was no turning back now. The house had been so quiet all evening that it seemed to be holding its breath with me. I tried to distract myself with useless chores like pointing out clothes that didn't need to be folded, cleaning counters that were already immaculate, and moving pillows on the couch. I couldn't stop the images from playing in my head like a movie reel, and I couldn't stop thinking about the way Xavier had looked at me in the bathroom, the flush on his cheeks as he turned away, the lingering touch of his hands as he studied me. It troubled me. All of it was incorrect. I was aware of it, yet nonetheless, here I was. A part of me that I didn't want to identify wondered what Xavier was doing, but I was restless and distracted, my mind betraying me at every step, and I caught myself looking at the wall clock at the dim gleam of light seeping from the breach beneath his door upstairs. I felt a strange fire curling down in my stomach if he was also thinking about that time. I turned abruptly, as if I could brush it off my skin like water. The darkness was pressing in on me, oppressive and thick, while the summer breeze was buzzing weakly outside. The home felt quiet, even with the sound of crickets. The sharpness of my thoughts may be dulled by a drink, I concluded. I made my way to the kitchen in silence, poured a glass of wine, and took my first drink, letting the cool stem rest on my hand. Burned, but I convinced myself that it helped to steady myself. My pulse accelerated reflexively as I leaned against the counter and stared at nothing. The only sound in the room I was observing was the hum of the refrigerator, and then I heard a faint creak and the distinct sound of footsteps on the stairs. I turned the wine glass halfway to my lips just as Xavier appeared in the doorway. He was wearing loose sweatpants and a fitted t-shirt that clung a bit too tightly to his shoulder lines. His hair was tousled as if he had just run a hand through it, and there was something unguarded about him at that moment that made my breath catch. He stopped when he saw me, a flicker of hesitation crossing his face. The rest of the group went on politely when I questioned him how much his sensation had put him in stasis while we were holding hands. His voice was so low it sent a chill down my spine as he whispered, "I didn't think you'd still be up." Rice's mouth curled slightly at the corners in a smirk. The inquiry lingered in the air for an excessive amount of time, trying to appear more casual than I actually felt. He nodded and moved farther into the room, his bare feet hardly sounding on the tile. Do you mind if I join? The inquiry lingered in the air for an excessive amount of time. Although I knew I should have answered no, I ended up responding in a softer tone than I had planned. Sure, Rice responded, going to the cabinet to get a glass and pour himself a drink. I was unable to stop myself from watching him out of the corner of my eye as he moved fluidly and leisurely. The idea made my stomach turn. Every confident movement reminded me that he was no longer a boy, and I hastily turned my head away, my hand gripping the wine glass a little tighter. At the little table, he took a seat at the kitchen's corner, and after a little pause, I went to join him. I was hyper-aware of everything, even the soft sound of his breathing and the little feel of his arm next to mine, and the way his eyes darted toward me when he thought I wouldn't notice. And the space between us felt too narrow, and the air too heavy. Finally breaking the pause, Xavier murmured, "You've been quiet tonight." His voice was kind and cautious, but it also had a hint of something else. Something made me grin a little, but it was an empty smile. I suppose I'm simply worn out. He nodded and swirled his glass of wine, exhausted from being here by himself. I was taken aback by the question and looked up to meet his gaze. At first, Xavier remained silent and simply stared at me. The silence was so lengthy that I feared he would not respond. But then he did. The constriction in my chest, being here alone and Xavier, it's not easy. At first, Xavier remained silent and simply stared at me. The silence was so lengthy that I feared he would not respond. But then he did. "You need not be Jen," he said. Xavier's words overwhelmed me, causing my heart to falter and my breath to become trapped in my throat. Although Xavier's words were barely audible, they had a profound impact on me. I had no idea what to say. I was unable to take my eyes off him. Couldn't help but notice how the distance between us appeared to get less every second. I began, "Xavier," but the words stuck in my mouth. "I'm not trying to make this strange," he added quietly. I see you, Cassandra." He shook his head. At that moment, I ought to have stood up and cut the talk short, but I didn't. "I can see how alone you are. Are there a lot of things that are left unsaid in the air?" I should have pushed back, gotten up, and stopped the conversation then. But I didn't. Instead, I sat there with my skin tingling and my pulse pounding in my ears, feeling as if every nerve had been set on fire. Xavier moved, leaning forward just a little, and all of a sudden, he was close enough for me to smell the same cedar scent that had permeated the hallway earlier. I became immobile. My breathing was difficult. "You're beautiful," he added softly, almost in a respectful tone, as if he hadn't intended to say it. Say them aloud and I feel my heart skip a beat, the room tilt, and the world become smaller. I felt vulnerable once again when we were alone, much like I had in the bathroom, except that there was no cool porcelain sink to keep me in place. I said, not sure what I was trying to say, "Rice," meaning just him. The weight of his eyes, and the way they seemed to look straight through me, as if he knew I was on the verge of something I couldn't escape. He remained still and silent while he watched me wait. What's worse is that he was right in 2017. I knew it then as I sat there with my hands leaning slightly against the stem of the wine glass. I knew it in the way my body betrayed me by leaning just a little bit closer, as if drawn by some invisible force that I couldn't resist. However, before anything else could happen, before I could let myself fall completely into the current pulling at me, Xavier leaned back. His expression was unreadable, and his voice was steady as he said, "Good night, Cassandra." And then he was gone, leaving me sitting there with my skin still buzzing with the ghost of his presence. My thoughts a tangled mess of shame and something darker, something I wasn't yet ready to name. I sat there for a long time after he left, staring at the empty space where he had been. The house was silent again, but the quiet wasn't the same. It was a thrumming with the memory of what had just happened and the weight of everything it meant. Something had changed between us. and I knew it then. The home had been too quiet, and I knew deep down that there was no turning back. I could feel it like a fracture growing through glass, gradual, inevitable, and difficult to ignore. It seemed to be holding its breath with me all evening, so I tried to keep myself occupied with useless activities like pointing out clothes that didn't need to be folded, cleaning counters that were already immaculate, and moving pillows on the couch. I did anything to divert my attention and stop the images from playing in my head like a movie reel that I couldn't stop, like the way Xavier had looked at me in the bathroom and the flush on his cheeks as he turned away, the lingering touch of his hands as he studied me. It troubled me. All of it was incorrect. I was aware of it, yet nonetheless here I was. Distracted and restless, my mind betraying me at every turn. I found myself looking at the wall clock, at the dim glow of light leaking from the crevice under Xavier's door upstairs. A part of me, which I prefer not to identify, wondered what he was doing and whether he was also thinking about that moment. The thoughts caused an unidentified heat to curl low in my stomach, and I turned abruptly. The night seemed thick and oppressive, even though I could brush it off like water from my skin. Outside, crickets were making a light buzzing sound, but the house still felt oppressive. I decided that something might help to calm the edge of my thoughts, so I went quietly to the kitchen, poured a glass of wine, and let the cold steam settle against my palm. The first sip burned, but I told myself that it steadied me. I leaned against the counter and stared at nothing, the refrigerator humming as the only sound in the room I was watching, until I heard it, a faint creak, the distinct sound of footsteps on the stairs, and my heart began to race. My gaze shifted to the wine glass. He was wearing loose sweatpants and a fitted t-shirt that clung a bit too comfortably to the lines of his shoulders. His hair was tousled as if he had just run a hand through it, and there was something unguarded about him in that moment that made my breath catch. I asked him how much his sensation rendered him in stasis, and the rest of the group moved on respectfully. "I didn't think you'd still be up," he whispered, his voice so low it sent a chill down my spine. Rice's mouth curled slightly at the corners in a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, as I shrugged, trying to appear more casual than I actually felt. He nodded and moved farther into the room, his bare feet hardly sounding on the tile. "Do you mind if I accompany you?" The question hung in the air for just a second too long. I knew I should have answered no, but I ended up speaking more quietly than I had planned. I watched from the corner of my eye as Rice went to the cabinet, got a glass, and poured himself a drink. His smooth and leisurely movements made it impossible for me to stop myself. Every confident gesture made me realize that he was no longer a boy, and the notion made my stomach turn, and I hastily turned my head away, my hand gripping the wine glass a little tighter. At the little table, he took a seat at the kitchen's corner, and after a little pause, I went to join him. I was hyper-aware of everything, even the soft sound of his breathing and the little feel of his arm next to mine, the way his eyes darted toward me when he thought I wouldn't notice, and the space between us felt too narrow and the air too heavy. Finally breaking the stillness, Xavier observed, "You've been quiet tonight." In addition to being cautious and kind, there was another element in his voice that I couldn't quite identify. A tiny smile came to my face. "I guess I'm just tired," he said, nodding, though it seemed empty. The question took me by surprise, and I looked up as I swirled the wine in his glass, bored of being here by myself. He was staring at me now, his eyes inscrutable and still. They were understanding without condemnation or sympathy. I hesitated, experiencing the same constriction in my chest. Being here alone, and with Xavier, it's not easy. Xavier didn't say anything at first. He just looked at me, and for a moment, the quiet stretched so long that I thought he wouldn't answer. Then finally he spoke. "Jen told Xavier that he didn't have to be." I was shocked when he spoke about healthcare, even though it was no more than a whisper. His words caused my heart to pound and my breath to pause in my throat. I had no idea what to say. I was unable to take my eyes off him. Couldn't help but notice how the distance between us appeared to get less every second. I began, "Xavier," but the words stuck in my mouth. "I'm not trying to make this strange," he added quietly. I see you, Cassandra." He shook his head slightly, as if to interrupt me before I could finish whatever it was about to say. "I can see how alone you are. Are the things that are unsaid causing the air to crackle?" I should have resisted. Instead of standing up and ending the conversation immediately, I chose not to do so. Instead, I sat there with my skin tingling and my pulse pounding in my ears, feeling as if every nerve had been set on fire. Xavier moved, leaning forward just a little, and all of a sudden, he was close enough for me to smell the same cedar scent that had permeated the hallway earlier. I became immobile. My breathing was difficult. He spoke softly, almost reverently, as if he hadn't intended to say it aloud. "You're beautiful." My heart skipped a beat as the room tilted and narrowed to just the two of us. I felt vulnerable again, just like I had in the bathroom. But this time there was nothing to hold me in place but him and the weight of his eyes, which seemed to see right through me. I whispered, but I wasn't sure what I was trying to say. But he didn't move. He didn't say anything. He just watched me, waiting as if he knew I was on the verge of something I couldn't recover from. And the worst was he was right. I knew it in 2017, as I sat there with my hands shaking slightly against the stem of the wineglass. I knew it in the way my body betrayed me by leaning just a little bit closer, as if drawn by some unseen force that I couldn't resist. However, before I could let myself fall completely into the current pulling at me, Xavier leaned back. His expression was unreadable, but his voice was steady as he said, "Good night, Cassandra." And then he was gone, leaving me sitting there with my skin still buzzing with the ghost of his presence, my thoughts a tangled mess of shame and something darker, something I wasn't yet ready to name. I sat there for a long time after he left, staring at the empty space where he'd been. The house was silent again, but the quiet wasn't the same. It was alive, throbbing with the memory of what had just happened. I realized then that something had changed between us because of the weight of what it signified. It felt to me like a crack. It was slow, inexorable, and difficult to ignore as it spread through glass, and I knew deep down that there was no turning back. The home had never seemed so small, and in the days following that night, the air seemed to retain the weight of everything we hadn't said. I would swear that I could feel Xavier's presence even when he wasn't there, as if the walls had learned his form, and repeated it to me in a whisper each time I turned away. I tried to tell myself that it was all in my brain, that the spark, the tension, the breathlessness, the moment we shared was brief and pointless. But that was the issue, wasn't it? It wasn't a dream. It was living and genuine, pulsing between us like a stream. I attempted to avoid him at first, but no one else could see. I would wait until his footsteps stopped creaking on the stairs before leaving my room. If he was in the kitchen, I would eat an apple from the bowl in the living room instead of running the danger of bumping into him at the counter. It was childish, but I couldn't help it. Being around him felt like being too close to a flame. Dangerous, exciting, and far too tempting. However, the more I avoided him, the harder it was to get rid of the thoughts that followed me everywhere I went. I would keep thinking about the way his hand had touched mine, the warmth of his skin, and the way his voice softened when he said my name. I hated myself for it because it made my heart race and my breath catch, and it left me lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering what he was thinking. On the third day, the tension snapped. The house was too quiet, the kind of silence that envelops you like a vice. I slipped out of bed, padding barefoot down the stairs to the kitchen, the moonlight spilling in through the window. Soft and silver as I reached for a glass in the cupboard, the sound of footsteps stopped me. I turned right as Xavier stepped into the doorway, his silhouette silhouetted against the dim hallway light. For a time, we just gazed at one another, neither of us moving nor talking, unable to sleep either. He inquired in a quiet, almost timid voice. He must have entered the kitchen when I felt that tug, that invisible thread, again, and I shook my head, turning away to fill the glass with water. No, I was simply restless, attaching myself to him. I could feel his eyes on me, watching, waiting, and he proceeded to the refrigerator, taking out a bottle of water and resting against the counter without saying anything further, no matter how hard I wanted to stop him. "Cassandra," he murmured at last. When my name was called, I flinched too softly, too cautiously. I put down my glass and turned to face him, my heart thumping in my ears. He stopped, his eyes searching mine as if he were trying to find the proper words, and I said nothing, trying to think of how to respond. "Are you okay?" To be honest, I don't believe the question should have affected me in that manner. But it did. Gulped forcefully, unable to maintain eye contact. "I am doing well. Do you?" Gently he pressed. "Since you don't seem to be okay," his voice has become quieter. As I glanced up at him, my chest constricted. He was taken aback by the question and blinked, but he didn't turn away because he answered, "I do." My lungs were drained of breath by his candor. My response came out of my lips, but it got trapped between my chest and my neck. We both stood there for a long time. The distance between us was getting less by the second, and the kitchen felt smaller. "You don't need to act fake with me." I detested the way those words appeared to pierce me and how deeply they touched me, he murmured softly. Right through the barriers I had erected around myself, my hands shook a little. I concealed it by clenching my fingers into fists. Xavier cocked his head slightly, his gaze kind but unblinking. "I'm not acting." "Indeed, you are." I walked away. I couldn't keep his eyes on me any longer because my heart was racing and my mind was a jumbled mass that I couldn't sort out. He whispered, Cassandra," gentler this time, but I could feel him move before I heard him, his presence moving closer, the slight warmth of his touch on my back. "Please don't." "Don't what?" "Don't," I begged as I closed my eyes and gasped for air. "Don't do this." My voice faltered, deceiving me. I could feel him there so near. I could almost hear his heartbeat. The quiet was thick and oppressive. "Don't say things you shouldn't say." He didn't move or talk. His voice barely audible above a whisper, charged with a desire I wasn't yet ready to define. As I turned to look at him, my chest constricted. Something that I could no longer contain was burning in my eyes. My voice broke as I replied, "You don't understand what it's like to feel invisible. To feel like you don't matter." The words of the renowned Nicole Drake Xavier have softened Xavier's face. He stared at me, his eyes steady. "I'm not blind to you," the words struck. He struck me in the chest, and as I gazed at him, my breath caught and my heart pounded with such intensity that it overshadowed everything else. I wanted to argue and tell him that he was wrong, but I couldn't because I knew deep down that he wasn't. I could see the faint rise and fall of his chest, the way his jaw tensed, as if he was holding himself back. And I felt the pull, the inevitable nature of it, and for a brief moment I allowed myself to lean into it. I wasn't sure who moved first, but suddenly I found myself close enough to feel his warmth and see the flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. His hand lifted slightly, as if he were about to touch me. But he stopped his fingers just shy of my skin, "Cassandra," and he whispered my name like a question. A plea I swallowed forcefully. I muttered back, "This can't happen," my breath unsteady. It's not that he argued, moved, but the way he looked at me and his eyes searched mine made it impossible to ignore the truth. Whether we wanted it to or not, something had already happened. The hallway clock chimed softly, breaking the spell. and I quickly stepped back, putting distance between us. My heart was thumping in my chest, and Xavier remained silent as he watched me. His expression unreadable, but I could see the same thing in his eyes. My footsteps echoed in the silence as I turned and left the kitchen without saying another word. However, the silence was no longer empty. It was filled with everything we couldn't take back, and everything we hadn't said. I knew, as I closed the door to my room behind me and climbed the stairs, that this wasn't over yet, and that the storm outside had been building for hours. Amidst the turmoil within, the wind pressed hard against the home, shaking the windows as if it were attempting to break in. I sat curled at the edge of the bed, the lovely pool of light from the bedside lamp illuminating the room, and I was loud, relentless, and difficult to ignore. For the last few days, it did little to ease the discomfort that should have been there. Since it followed me everywhere, I pressed my palms against my knees and took a slow, shaky breath at Julian's absence. I tried to act as though nothing had changed between us, that I hadn't noticed the shift in the air feeling heavier when Xavier was in the room. But it was impossible to ignore now that it was in everything. Every glance that lingered too long, every word that carried a weight it shouldn't, every step I took that somehow brought me closer to him, seemed like an unfillable emptiness, and Xavier was everywhere, occupying the empty places. I detested how often I thought about him and how frequently I found myself wondering if he was also considering me and where he was in the home. I knew it was bad, but my heart thumped as I heard quiet, methodical footsteps down the corridor. That silence told me who it was without my having to look. I listened while sitting still, unable to move the awareness that weighed heavily on my chest. After a minute, someone knocked. Cassandra sounded cautious and low, as if he realized he shouldn't be here. Before responding, "Come in," I tried to stabilize myself by closing my eyes for a moment. When I looked up, I saw Xavier waiting in the doorway with his hands in his sweatpants pockets. He had changed and appeared less reserved tonight. The door creaked quietly as it opened. Less cautiously, the dim light struck the angles of his face, creating shadows that gave him an older, more certain appearance, as if he had already made up his mind on something I couldn't sleep about. I said quietly, breaking the silence with my voice. Before entering the room, he shook his head. It was an understanding, not a question, and he stood there for a time, seemingly undecided about approaching before doing so slowly. My chest constricted, and my breath caught in a way that made me dizzy. He stopped at the foot of the bed, his eyes steady as he looked at me. "Cassandra?" He repeated my name, softer this time, as if he wasn't sure how to go on, and that was that. "You shouldn't be here, Xavier," I said, swallowing hard. The sound was deafening in the silence. "I understand." The naked and unguarded revelation lingered between us, shattering something within me for a minute that left me gasping for oxygen. I opened my lips to say, "Tell him to go," but nothing came out. I detested myself for not wanting him to go. Finally, with a shaking voice, I murmured, "You can't say things like that." "Well," he said softly, "not really. It's the reality." The way his eyes swept across mine, open and fearless, made me look up at him. The storm outside seemed to get louder, the wind howling against the house, but it might as well have been silent because all I could hear was the pounding of my own heartbeat and the quiet assurance in his voice. "I can't do this," I said softly, shaking my head. He said, "I can't let this happen, but it already has," in a voice that was almost audible above a whisper. "You know it has hit me," he said, "like a shock, like the ground moved beneath my feet and left me dangling over the edge." He was correct, and I knew it. It had begun long before today, in the quiet, in the looks that were stolen, in the times when the air seemed thick, and it had been growing for days and weeks until it was finally undeniable. Xavier moved closer and closer until he was directly in front of me. My hands shook where they were on my knees, but I didn't back down. I couldn't. His eyes remained steady and inquisitive, and I had the impression that he could see everything. He told me to leave, and he said it quietly and steadily. If you really want me to go, I will, but if you don't, I will. He left the words unfinished. I was about to advise him to go so that this would stop before it got any worse, but I said nothing. I looked at him, my throat constricted, my heart thumping so loudly I was afraid I may lose it, and then he extended his hand and tentatively, tenderly, brushed it against mine, as if he was waiting to see whether I would draw away. Even though I knew I should have, I chose to freeze my flesh instead. Tingling at the contact, my breath hitching as his fingers curled gently around mine, he whispered again. My name like a question. I looked up at him, my vision blurring slightly, and for a moment everything else fell away. The storm outside, the guilt pressing against my chest, the voice in my head screaming that this was wrong. It all disappeared. There was only him, and then I moved. I didn't think about it and didn't stop to question it. I just leaned forward, closing the space between us until my forehead rested lightly against his. His breath was warm, against my skin again, his hand tightening slightly around mine, and I felt it shift to the point of no return. We stayed like that for what felt like forever, neither of us moving, both of us holding on to something we couldn't name, my mouth. My heart raced, my skin burning, but I couldn't pull away. I didn't want to. You sure? Xavier asked softly, his voice shaking just slightly like he wasn't as certain as he seemed. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Instead, I let my free hand lift, trembling slightly to rest against his cheek, his eyes closed at the contact, his breath hitching as though he couldn't believe this was real, and then slowly and carefully he leaned in. The world tilted, and my thoughts scattered like leaves in the wind, and all I could feel was him, his warmth, his presence, the steady weight of his hand against mine. The kiss when it came was soft at first, tentative and searching, as though we were both afraid of what this meant, but it didn't stay that way because the truth was this had been coming for a long time. It was inevitable, unstoppable, and now that the line had been crossed, there was no turning back. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a small voice whispered that this was a mistake, that I was teetering on the edge of something that would change everything. But I didn't listen. I couldn't, because in that moment, nothing else mattered. Outside, the storm raged on. But inside it was quiet, and as Xavier's arms wrapped around me, pulling me closer, I let myself fall, and I knew even then that the fall would be impossible to undo.